Yeah, if anybody wants a paper, save the trees. Yeah, don't pass out. Just pass the papers out. Don't want anybody to pass out. Well, it's been a couple weeks again as I was at Lakeside last Sunday night. So we also had 2 weeks. We had a week in between before then also. So it may feel like we're coming into something new just because we had been, every week without any gaps, but now we have had a little rest, I guess, from our journey. And we're going to continue. We're going to pick up in chapter 7 of Joshua. The last thing we looked at was the popular chapter 6, which is the Jericho chapter, marching around the city. And just to give us a little refresher there, on that seventh day, Joshua told the people that the entire city of Jericho was to be devoted to destruction. And what that means is basically destroyed. Destroy it all. Devoted to Jehovah, devoted to destruction, except for Rahab and all those that were with her in her house, because she hid the messengers. That's verse 17. He also told them not to take anything from the city at all, but to destroy it all. Alfred Edersheim said, in all other cases, or he pointed out, that in all other cases the inhabitants alone were smitten with the edge of the sword, while the cattle and the spoil were preserved. But in the case of Jericho, for reasons to be stated later on, the whole city, with all that it contained, was to be devoted to destruction. And they did exactly as they were commanded, or so it would seem. So as far as the narrative is concerned, we're going to. It seems everything just went perfectly well, and they did exactly as God commanded. We're going to learn here then in chapter 7 that something went awry. And that's whenever they're coming to Ai. So Jericho was first. They crossed the Jordan around Jericho, north and south wise, east of the Jordan, into the west, across the Jordan westward. Jericho was the first city. It was a very monumental deal, because this was the first city in the land of Canaan proper that they were going to be taking and possessing. Next was Ai. So they're going to just sort of do the same thing they did with Jericho. But they're going to learn a lesson here that God would also, as He did with the people of Canaan, He would also sanctify Himself on them if they transgressed His covenant. And that they could conquer only so long as they were faithful to Him. They may not have really comprehended that at first, but they would after this. Because we learned that not everybody obeyed God's command regarding the things of Jericho, but we meet a man here named Achan. Ironically, total coincidence that we're going to be looking at Achan Wednesday night. Just, what are the odds? I guess the odds would be quite large that they would land on the same time, the same week. So we won't maybe look at Achan in too much detail here tonight. I will point out this. Who does it say broke faith in the text? The people of Israel broke faith. Isn't that interesting? Because what actually happened was this one man, Achan of Judah, he took some of the devoted things. He took some things from Jericho. They weren't supposed to do that. They're supposed to destroy it all. But apparently in the process, Achan saw some stuff and he thought, you know what? I'd kind of like to have that. What's the point of just destroying that? I'll just, stick it right here in the pocket here. And, nobody will be aware. But according to the text, Israel broke faith. One man's sin affected the whole people. And the anger of Jehovah burned against the people of Israel. Well, Joshua and the rest of the people are unaware about, they don't know about this. So this is just Joshua, or whoever wrote the book of Joshua, presumably Joshua, filling us in on a little detail to help chapter 7 make sense. Because otherwise it wouldn't make much sense, just like it didn't make sense to Joshua. Joshua sent men to Ai to spy out the land. They decided, you know what, it's so vulnerable that only about 2,000 or 3,000 men ought to do. That's all we need. So they did that. They sent this 3,000 men to conquer Ai. But something goes horribly and unexpectedly wrong. We read in verse 4 that they fled before the men of Ai. And the men of Ai killed about 36 of their men and chased them before the gate. And the hearts of the people melted and became as water. Their hearts melted. Now they expected Ai to be Jericho part 2. Exactly what happened to Jericho? We'll just do it again. Here we go. We're doing this process. But they lost. So Joshua tears his clothes. He falls on the ground before the ark of Jehovah until the evening. And the elders with him, and they put dust on their heads. And he cries out to God, you know, why? Why, God? What is this about? Why is this happening? What will you do for your great name? Notice that, though. Joshua is primarily concerned about God's legacy, his reputation, his name. This looks bad on God, he's thinking. Because, you know, God is our captain or whatever. Jehovah is our captain, and he just got beat. Well, Jehovah tells Joshua then, he says, get up. First words that he says, Joshua, get up. Why are you falling on your face? Why are you so confused? Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant that I commanded them. They have taken some of the devoted things. They've stolen and lied and put them among their own belongings. Notice all those plural words. Again, Israel did it. They did this, they did that, even though it was just Achan. But it was, as far as God was concerned, it was a collective thing. Therefore, the people of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. So here he fills Joshua in and says, here's why this happened. I've already told you that this is the way it would be if you transgressed. Well, this thing is happening, so therefore somebody's transgressed. Maybe he expected Joshua to have put that together already, but he didn't, so he goes ahead and fills them in. That's all Joshua needed to hear. We read another familiar phrase. Joshua rose early in the morning. He says, first, I will be with you no more unless you destroy the devoted things from among you. So Joshua rose early in the morning. He brought Israel near, tribe by tribe. Now they're going to determine who it was. Why didn't God just tell him? I don't know. Can't read God's mind. I don't know why he didn't tell him, but he had his reasons, I'm sure. They're going to figure it out one way or another. So all the tribes, they gather around. It finally falls to Achan. And he demands a confession. He gets a confession. And they are going to do what they are commanded to do. Stone him. He's to be executed. Stone him with stones. Notice verse 20. Achan answered Joshua, truly I have sinned against Jehovah God of Israel. And this is what I did. And then he explains what he did. Another instance of a man confessing his sin to another man, which was to his credit. but he was still going to suffer the consequences. I don't have any doubt that spiritually speaking, or ultimately speaking, we might say, Achan did himself a huge favor by doing this, confessing it, acknowledging it, confessing it. But, who can say, really? What we do know is that he still was going to have to suffer the earthly consequences of his action. The lesson needed to be taught, and that's exactly what was going to happen. All Israel stoned him with stones, and his family, by the way, which leads us to assume, or we should assume, his family had something to do with it. We don't know what part they played, but they must have played some part, because God is just, He's righteous, and He does not punish the son for the sins of the father, or vice versa. So the fact that the family was a part of this, just like with, his name slips my mind here, starts with a K, Korah. Just like Korah's rebellion against Moses and Aaron, his family was a part of that punishment too, so that would lead us to assume the same thing, that their families had something to do with it. Maybe it was helping to hide the things, maybe they helped lie about them, maybe they just knew about it and didn't do anything. But in some way his family was involved, which again is another tragic thing, that he dragged his family into it, because now they're hurting because of it. Yes? Yeah. I'm not being negative, I'm just saying. No, that's a very legitimate thing. I mean, it is very, the contrast is very stark. I mean, it's very much black and white, the difference. And I think one thing that helps me to sort of reconcile the two is, I wouldn't think of it so much as Old Testament versus New Testament, as this was a unique period and a unique situation where God was punishing these peoples for their wickedness. And, after this conquering was done, we don't really see God telling them to go and conquer anywhere else or kill anybody or anything like that, but more, we do see a lot of those New Testament principles of being neighborly and all this, even in the Old Testament. But this period in Joshua, and really just Joshua, I guess, was that unique period where God was punishing these nations for their wickedness. And I think it was as much, recorded at least, as much to help us to learn about God as anything. So every single, all these things are sort of previews or shadows of God's justice and His judgment ultimately. So what God did to them, He can do to us. Whether it's as a nation, which He does on earth, or whether it's an individual, in the end, if I am wicked like they were wicked, then I'm going to be destroyed in the end. So, but the difference, it's hard to, like you said, it's difficult to wrap our minds around when we think of it as like an immediate thing. That's how it feels to us, because we just...
Are we supposed to kill our enemies? I mean, in war and stuff, when it says to love your enemies, it's just, when I read that, I'm thinking, well, how far did we go with this? And
That's a very...
are we doing right or wrong?
That is an excellent point. And it is hard to answer that without being extremely controversial. and I'm no stranger to controversy, but I'll just speak for myself. I personally, considering the principle you just said in the New Testament and the whole balance of the New Testament, I would personally not feel comfortable doing that. I understand that war is different than going into somebody's house and killing them. No question. There is no question that there's a difference. But spiritually speaking, that's still me as a person taking somebody's life. If I have any way to avoid that, that's the choice I would want to take personally. I would never go so far as to condemn Christians who are in the military. That would be inappropriate. But as for myself, I struggle, just like you said, I would struggle with that, and I want to do everything I can to avoid even having to make that choice. I wouldn't want to be the person that pulls the lever on the electric chair either, for that same reason. Even though I know God condones capital punishment, and He approves of it, but I wouldn't want to be, for multiple reasons, I wouldn't want to be that person. But, if there are people who are not God's people that can do that, play that role. As for God's people, I think it's overall better to fight the spiritual battle first of all, and maybe leave those others to others. Ideally, we would never even have to fight wars at all. Nobody would. Yes?
Well, the Old Testament is for our learning, and so you're learning in the Old Testament, do what God says, or there's immediate consequences. In the New Testament, we still have to do what God says, or we go to hell.
Yeah, that's the overarching application is, if you disobey God, God will make you deal with the consequences, whether on earth or in the end. And that's really the application of the Old Testament, is that God, what we learn, the pattern, is that God deals with nations on earth. He's not going to judge nations on Judgment Day. He does that on earth. He can judge nations with other nations, and then He'll judge that nation with another nation after that. That's what He did throughout the whole Old Testament. He used Israel to judge Canaan, and then He used Assyria to judge Israel, and then He used Babylonia to judge Judah, and then He used Persia to judge Babylonia, and then He just goes on and on and on. That's how God deals with nations. That we can apply that to our nation. If we are not a nation who follows God, who keeps God's principles, then we better watch out, because we learn that precedent from the Old Testament that God deals with nations here on earth, and He can raise up He can do exactly what He did here in Joshua today, and raise up a nation to punish America. He could do that, and we would be in the position of the Israelites in Jeremiah's day, like we talked about this morning, where we maybe, instead of thinking God is going to raise up somebody to defend us from this nation, we need to stop and realize maybe God has raised up this nation to punish us, and submit and with humility. Mm-hmm.
I think the New Testament pretty much tells you your salvation is your personal responsibility. There's no, in other words, there's not a group of people coming here and sitting with everybody who may be of like mind. It's not going to save you.
Mm-hmm.
Just being in proximity. It's the way God talked to people and the way people talk to God. David got in trouble because he didn't ask God how he should move the cart. He didn't look to see. So he specifically, these people, Hebrews, he talked to them. They talked to God, and God came down and told them exactly what to do. Now He's told us through His Son. And I think because, the Jews, the big mistake they made, there was precept upon precept, line upon line. It's in Isaiah. They just kept piling more and more little bitty things, stair steps trying to get to heaven, instead of recognizing that there are bigger things that God expects from us. And that's personal responsibility to Him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can't pull the lever. I feel like it's not, I mean, I've been sitting here praying somebody takes over our government for us that's more sane or whatever. And then I thought, well, I can't personally pick up a thing, but I can sure pray for those who are getting it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yep. Everybody can do that much. Just pray. And
don't you think that, like, one of the, I think, really cool things about the huge contrast is, like, it makes Jesus' coming to the earth, like, really, like, a huge moment. Like, the fact that He literally changed the way the world is, like, in the message He brought was, like, something, like, unheard of to the world. It, like, makes it, like, everybody should have, like, even more, like, wow, this is different, you know what I mean? Like, than
yeah. Totally foreign to the notions of the world. It was totally foreign to the notions of the Jews. They thought Jesus was going to be like Joshua, like David. Let's go out to war. We're going to fight Rome. We're going to kick Rome's rear end. And then we'll be the big dog. That's what they thought was going to happen. They still do, some of them at least. Very similar to what the Muslims want to do. We want to be the world's superpower. Well, unfortunately for them, the United States of America is the world's superpower. Whether people want to accept it or not, which is one of the admirable things about the founding fathers of this country, that they didn't want to, and they declared, we're not going to go out and conquer. We just want you to leave us alone, basically. We'll fight if you don't leave us alone, but we don't, we've got the most incredibly advanced and powerful military the world has ever known. We could take over the world if we wanted to. Absolutely. Easily. Nobody could stand a chance against the United States military. But the world should be thankful that that's not what America has been built to do. You're welcome, world, that we don't act like Russia and some of these other places that, hey, that's our territory and we're going to take it back because we think we ought to have it. But we're just that, the sleeping dog or whatever that knows it can get you if you mess with it. And I think that's because of Jesus. Jesus' principles. Yes?
well, that's the difference in the Old Testament and the New. To me, is the same problem that we have understanding how Jesus could be 100% human and yet 100% God. Israel was to present or represent the human lineage of Jesus. Now, Rahab kind of messes up part of my theory, but I mean, there was a lineage that was to be preserved for proof that He was the Son of God. And yet the New Testament, through His life and His resurrection, proves that He also is the Son of God. I mean, those two things are really hard
Yeah, they are.
to
No doubt.
comprehend.
And thankfully, he gave plenty of proof to help us out. You think God doesn't know that it's difficult to believe that, or understand or comprehend the God-man? Of course He knows. That's why He did a whole lot to help us understand. And even if we can't understand, we can still believe. We can still trust. We can still put our faith in Him. So once they got rid of Achan, the sin, and by the way, that's another common aspect of the Old Testament, just the way things worked back then, was purging the evil out of Israel meant getting rid of a person or a group of persons. And so you will purge the evil from Israel. Guess what happened when they purged the evil? God's anger subsided. He was with them again. So they went up, round 2, or I guess you could say the rematch in chapter 8. They go up and they take Ai just as easy as can be. They followed God's instructions, and they took Ai, and they were successful. So they failed the first time because of the sin in the camp. They got rid of the sin in the camp, and they were successful. Joshua then renews the covenant, the last part of chapter 8. He builds an altar of uncut stones, just according to the command of God, upon which no man has wielded an iron tool. It's 8:31, exactly as instructed in Exodus 20, verse 25. Very interesting terminology there. If you wield your tool upon it, you've profaned it. That's what the Exodus account says. Then we have this picture that all Israel and all the sojourners with them stood on opposite sides of the Ark of the Covenant of Jehovah, half of them in front of Mount Gerizim and half of them in front of Mount Ebal. This is a large group of people. Here's the Ark of the Covenant, and on either side of it, this massive assembly of people. And Joshua makes the very first copy of the law, and upon completing it, get this, he reads the thing in its entirety. He reads it. He reads the whole thing. And it's intentionally redundant, it seems. How much did Joshua read? Well, let's see. It says, afterward he read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse. This is Joshua 8:34 and 35. According to all that is written in the book of the law, there was not a word of all that Moses commanded that Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, and the women, and the little ones, and the sojourners who lived among them. He read all the words, according to all that was written, and there was not a word of all that Moses wrote or commanded that he didn't read. How many more ways could he say it? He read all the words, and he did not read none of the words, or something like that. He didn't read none of them because he read all of them according to all of the words that were written. Even with the little ones there, the kids. They didn't do children's church back then, apparently. Even the little ones had to sit there. And the sojourners and the women and everybody is what is the point there. Chapter 9. The Gibeonites. Some slick, snaky people they were. Here's what we read. Joshua's camped at Gilgal, apparently a different Gilgal than the one near Jericho. They're camped at Gilgal, wherever this Gilgal was. All the rulers of all the surrounding areas had heard about the deeds that were going on from this God Jehovah and his people. So they gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. So here's the kings of all these places. I got them on the map here. Their respective territories. All these kings got together. They weren't friends, but they formed this common alliance to fight against Joshua and Israel with one accord. But the people of Gibeon, they had a different idea. They went a different route. Just for the record, Gibeon is supposed to be right around here somewhere, more or less right smack in the middle of Canaan. So that's important. These people, the people of this place, we read they acted, where's the verse here? They acted with cunning. Wrote a verse down, but it's not the right verse, so. Verse 4. They acted with cunning. How'd they do that? Well, here's what they did. They prepared these worn out garments, okay? You talk about an elaborate scheme. This is impressive. Worn out garments and worn out sacks for their donkeys. They prepared beat up sandals. They dried up food and old wineskins. They went out to meet the Israelites in this deceptive way, disguised as people from a very distant country. And their intention was to make a covenant with them. Now, let's just hold on just a second. Where in the world did they get this idea? Why would they go through all this trouble? It seems like a bit of a gamble. We got all the kings of all the whole land of Canaan allied together to fight against this people. They could have joined them, but instead, they did this whole big thing and then sort of traveled in a way that they would come from a different direction. They went through this whole elaborate thing to trick Joshua and Israel into thinking that they had come from a very distant country. Well, it all starts to make sense, at least an explanation of what they were doing, when we go back to Deuteronomy. It doesn't help us understand how in the world they knew about it, but it's just too much to believe that it's a coincidence. God told the people in Deuteronomy 7, and then in chapter 20 as well, He says, when Jehovah your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, you shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. Okay? There's part one. When you go into the land of Canaan, no covenant, no mercy to any of them. But notice this in chapter 20. When you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace to it. And if it responds to you peaceably and it opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall do forced labor for you and shall serve you. Goes on in verse 15. I'm getting ahead of myself. Thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not cities of the nations here. Now, how did Gibeon know? They had to have known about this somehow. Maybe they deduced it. Maybe they heard about it. Maybe they did their homework like Balaam seems to have done. Somehow, they had to have figured this out, this loophole. Their God told them that the cities that are far off from them, that are not in Canaan, they are to offer terms of peace, and if they respond peaceably to those terms, then they'll live. They'll get to do forced labor and serve them. They'll be their slaves, but their lives will be saved.
But wouldn't, once they found out that they actually were from right there, wouldn't that make the agreement null and void? Because it's
Well, let's see. Funny that you should ask. So they go to Joshua, and again, just at least respect the elaborate. I mean, this is just crazy. Worn out. They had to make these garments. Now, they may have had a lot of worn out stuff already, but at least they made them appear even more worn out, patched them up, and they had all this crusty old bread and stuff, just to be further convincing. Here's where they messed up. Verse 14. They were a little suspicious. They took some of their provisions to check them out. Okay, let me look at this stuff. But notice, they did not ask counsel from Jehovah. Now, there can be only one reason, really, why that probably was the case, is because they were so convincing. Or else they would have probably inquired. But they didn't. They fell into that snare. And so they made a vow. And remember, they did exactly what God's law said, if the Gibeonites had actually been from a far place. So, to their credit, they did what the law said. They were just deceived. But they still vowed and swore by the name of Jehovah that they would take them in and let them do forced labor and serve them according to the law. Now, once they found out about it, it was too late. Too late because they had sworn. Now, I find that interesting because like we said, in our culture, that would nullify any such arrangement. But they viewed their oaths so strongly that it didn't matter if there was deception involved. They were going to do what they said no matter what. And I admire that. I guess they thought we should have been more careful. We should have been more elaborate in our investigation. We should have inquired of Jehovah, mainly. But we swore. See, the congregation was mad at them, the leaders. They said, look what y'all have done. Now we've accidentally transgressed. But they said, we swore by the name of Jehovah. So we're not going to do it. We're not going to fight against them because we swore. So they let them, they fulfilled their end, even though that it was brought about by deception. So in chapter 10, very quickly, another infamous situation happens. We read of a man named Adonizedek. The latter part of his name may sound familiar, like Melchizedek. Melchizedek means king of righteousness. Adonizedek means Lord of righteousness, so they're pretty much synonymous names. He is said to be king of Jerusalem, which Melchizedek was also said to be. And when he heard about the destruction that's going on and about the Gibeonites rather, he was afraid. They made another alliance, but this time they were going to go against Gibeon. Gibeon says, hey, new friends Israel, come and help us, please. And they did. They lived up to their vow, their oath. So now they're fighting. God says, go, don't be afraid. I've given them into your hand. Not a man shall stand before you. So they go. Joshua and his men marched all night from Gilgal. And we read in verse 10 that Jehovah caused a great panic among the Amorites, maybe by thunder and lightning. Then he threw large stones from heaven. And it says there were more people that died from the hailstones than died by the sword. God did quite a bit there, directly. But guess what? Their time was running out. Daylight. We're running out of daylight. You don't want to fight at nighttime. Time's running out. So Joshua is going to ask God to perform the single most massive miracle he ever performed, except the creation itself. The largest scale miracle ever, right here, Joshua 10, as far as has ever been recorded at least. And I'm pretty sure if there was one bigger than this, it would have been recorded. He says, sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon, basically stop where you are. Sun, stand still, he said. And guess what happened? The sun stood still, and the moon stopped. And it allowed the nation to succeed in this battle. Now, here's the thing about this. I find it encouraging, even though critics may try to use this to show the ignorance of the Bible writers. Look at Joshua 10. It shows that whoever wrote the Bible thought that the sun revolved around the earth. Sun stands still. Sun's not moving around the earth. So that's just ignorant. Well, it is ignorant, but not because the Bible writers thought the sun was revolving around the earth. Joshua didn't know. Joshua's just a man. And not only is he just a man, he's just a man living, 1,300 years before Christ. All he knew was they needed more daylight. So he asked for it, and the only way from his perspective on earth, isn't that what we would want? There's the sun. Boy, wouldn't it be nice if it just stayed there for a little while? So he asked, in the only way he knew how, for that to happen. God, who knows how the universe works, he knew how to give Joshua what he asked for. Even though what Joshua asked for isn't what God actually did. Is it? Now that we know more about the universe and our solar system and everything, we know that the earth is actually moving around the sun. So what would God have to do to make the sun stop in the sky from Earth's vantage point? You're going to have to stop the earth. So, I mean, that's amazing. He stopped the earth from rotating and moving around in its orbit. The moon, he also would have to stop. See, the moon is moving around the earth. So we got multiple things going on here. The moon would have to stop. The earth would stop. Didn't really do anything to the sun. But he stopped. You know what would happen if this happened on its own? Well, I don't think anybody knows exactly what would happen, but I'll tell you one thing that would happen is we'd all be dead. Gravity is a very unforgiving thing. And this would just throw the whole thing out of whack. But God, the God who created the earth and the sun, the God who can stop the earth, can also miraculously prevent the side effects of doing this. And that's what he did. He stopped. This is a massive scale miracle. But the reason it's encouraging is because it mirrors what Paul said in Romans 8:26, that we don't know how to pray as we ought to pray. Sometimes we don't know what to pray for. We don't know how to pray for what we need. But he says, but the Spirit makes intercession for us. Well, Joshua didn't know how to pray for what he needed. So he did it in the only way he knew how. He knew what he wanted. He just didn't know what God's part was going to be in it and how God could make it happen. But God knew, and he answered the prayer despite Joshua's lack of information about it. And it's no different with you and I today. We can pray to God for something, and we may not understand how to word what we need or want, but God knows. He knows what's best for us. He knows what we want. Jesus also said he knows that you have need of these things. God knows. And he knows how to give it, grant it to us. And the text says there has been no day like that day before it or since, when Jehovah obeyed the voice of a man. Just fascinating to think about. Now, there were other times when God granted the requests of man, and we've already pointed out several times when we read that Jehovah did according to the word of Moses. But not in this way, which is what we're reading here in Joshua 10, verse 14. God did what Joshua asked, even though he asked for this. Now, he's not going to make the sun stand still for us. He doesn't operate like that anymore. But he does answer prayers. And he can do things that we can't comprehend and wouldn't believe if he told us.
Did the sun actually stand still and stop, or was it that God extended the day?
Both, I think. From the earth's vantage point, what God made happen was the sun stopped. Like, here's the sun, where, it never stops. If you just look at it, it doesn't look like anything's happening. But if you could fast forward, you'd see that it's going. But in this case, it stopped. It stopped that pattern for an extended period of time, which was to make the day last longer. So he extended the day. He gave them daylight savings time, is pretty much what he did. The first ever instance of daylight savings time. But we understand, based on the science of it, that what God actually was doing was, way more complicated than just making the sun not move anymore in the sky from man's vantage point. Yes?
When Hezekiah talked to Isaiah, Isaiah asked God to make the sun, the shadow go back going forward have been nothing. So what God would have had to have done there was basically reverse the rotation of the earth, right?
That's possible. I guess it depends on how
To make the step.
exactly that. I guess there could be some ways that God could have made that happen in a less, like maybe like make that happen on the dial or whatever.
The shadow was their time.
Yeah, I know they usually would use that as the
If
time.
he moved it back 10 steps, the only way he could do that is to.
Yeah, that's the only way he could do it if he actually made the thing work the way it normally works and just made it go the other way, unless he did it in some like smaller way to make it appear that way for the sign, for the purposes of the sign or whatever. But
Just in a small thing, not stopping them.
yeah,
Sun.
but assuming if he did do it just, the obvious way, it would be a very large scale, just like, similar to this one. Just sort of making things go backwards. So yeah, that's those things we wish we had more information about, because, man, the power of God. So if he can do that, most of the things that we would like him to do, piece of cake, as far as we're concerned. So don't ever doubt the power of God. The people of Canaan weren't doubting the power of Jehovah. They were scared. And the Gibeonites knew they didn't have a chance. Well, thankfully, we can be like Joshua and the others and have God on our side.